climate change is fundamental to the energy industry at large and specifically to the oil and gas sector. Around 40% of our global greenhouse gas emissions arise from oil and gas, from the production and the consumption of oil and gas. So really to see dramatic action on climate change, which we need to get the world to net zero, to a well below 2-degree pathway, the production and consumption patterns of oil and gas must dramatically change and fundamentally, in many ways, decline by 2050. For natural gas, it's a little bit different. Natural gas is playing a role in helping to transition the world away from coal and to expand energy access in a efficient and effective way with relatively low emissions intensities, especially in Asia. So there's some continued headroom for growth in natural gas, but ultimately in the long term, natural gas consumption would need to decline as well and stabilize so at some point below consumption levels today. So that really has a profound impact for the industry overall. And any company operating within the oil and gas industry will need to determine effectively, what exactly are the risks, what is the role that they can play, both in providing energy access, affordable, efficient energy access today, but also preparing for that longer term future. So you can really split the actions taken so far across those that address the so-called Scope 1 and 2 emissions of the sector and those that address Scope 3. On Scope 1 and 2 emissions, those are emissions that arise directly from the production and transportation distribution of oil and gas to end consumers. This is fuel that's combusted, methane that's emitted in the form of producing and transporting natural gas. Recently, in the last several years, we've seen a significant increase in commitment by companies to act on Scope 1 and 2 emissions. The number of pledges for companies to put their own oil and gas production on a net zero pathway has really been tremendous. It started, of course, with many of the European IOCs, but we've now seen it across the US IOCs and independents, as well as NOCs globally. Just the other week, Sinopec announcing a net zero commitment. And these are really critical commitments because about 20% of the emissions from oil and gas globally actually comes from the production, transportation, processing in the form of refining of oil and gas. So companies have a significant opportunity here to make a dent in the global emissions of the oil and gas sector here just by taking steps on their own, addressing their own emissions footprint. Beyond that, we're looking at Scope 3, right, which is emissions that come from the consumption, the combustion, typically, of oil and gas. Here, steps are much earlier, much more preliminary. The European IOCs have, of course, been at the fore in setting Scope 3 emissions targets. And a lot of their steps are really focusing early on entering the renewable space, electrification. But that whole opportunity area and what companies will do to get their Scope 3 emissions footprint toward a net zero pathway, much of that has yet to be defined, and really where I think much of the innovation is going to come in the future years. So really what we're talking about here is a global energy transition, the likes of which we have never seen before. We are trying to move our global patterns of energy production and consumption to an entirely new footing in the next 30 years, really. To do that, we really need to see three things. One is policy, two, technology, and three, a shift in markets. On the first dimension on policy, I think we are seeing the growth of carbon pricing, seeing specific climate policy measures being implemented around the world. But we need to see more, right? and there really is no silver bullet. There's no one-size-fits-all policy to transition the global energy system and to motivate the scale of action we need to see on climate change. It really is an all-of-the-above type of approach that's needed. So in addition to carbon pricing and regulatory measures, we also need to see specific support for technology investments and to dramatically shift the capital allocation and capital structure that currently exists supporting our current energy mix today. On the second component of technology, we have many, if not, all of the fundamental technology building blocks that we need to achieve net zero across the world. But what we need to see is a dramatic increase and acceleration of deployment of those technologies. We need to see new business models, and we need to have the right incentives, of course, and at the end of the day, these technologies need to be cost competitive to play a role in getting the world toward net zero. So that really takes a combination of governments and the private sector to deploy these technologies that are needed. And then third, on markets. I think in recent years we've seen investor pressure significantly increasing here, pushing companies to get to net zero commitments. That's been incredibly helpful, but sort of needs to be accelerated further. And we also need stronger consumer pressure. Consumers have been largely silent in much of this, but at the end of the day, consumers of energy also need to demand that the world and their own consumption patterns are shifted to a more sustainable footing. So given it's a global energy transition that we need, and that energy transition touches from production all the way through consumption, that really needs collaboration between players in the oil and gas industry across the broader global energy ecosystem into the end-use sectors that are the consumers of energy. And I think there's three natural areas for collaboration going forward across oil and gas and these other sectors. One, and probably the starting point of all of this, is just getting clarity on the embedded emissions intensity of different energy sources. By and large, we don't really know what is a cleaner source of natural gas versus a more emissions intensive one, based upon methane emissions, flaring, and other measures to transport and process natural gas through the supply chain. Same with oil. So I think a first step here is just getting clarity on that, and that will help companies also to find the right incentives and motivate actions on reducing their scope 1 and 2 emissions. Second, we need an organized energy transition, right? The global economy functions fundamentally because we have stable, secure supply, affordable supply of energy globally. So ensuring that market stability, will require collaboration and, clear sort of market signals and contracts between consumers of energy, indicating that to their producers, so that there aren't sort of bumps in the road as we go. And then third, speaking to the deployment of technology that's needed to get us to net zero, that is truly going to be a collaborative effort. At the end of the day, technologies like hydrogen, carbon capture, use and storage, deployment of biofuels, all of those things will take collaboration and joint efforts between the oil and gas industry and other emissions intensive sectors like iron and steel, cement, aluminum, others, right, to be able to share in the knowledge of that technology, to deploy capital across different value chains, and to really join efforts into reducing emissions, especially to really decarbonize, continue to use oil and gas where it's cost effective, but decarbonize that at the endpoint of consumption.